Hello everyone, my name is Diego Ramirez. Today we'll be talking about the fate of lactate. Let's get started. So what is lactate? We do know that glycolysis has two forms of carbohydrate breakdown for production of ATP. So glucose comes in, there's either aerobic glycolysis, which is slow and yields a substantial amount of ATP. Because it goes through the Krebs cycle and all that whole process. And then there's also the anaerobic fast glycolysis. And this one results in lactate formation, but it does yield a limited amount of ATP production. And so which system does which system does the body use? It depends on if you're sprinting, definitely you're going to be utilizing the anaerobic fast glycolysis. If you're jogging, then you're probably going to be utilizing the aerobic slow glycolysis. So what happens then? The body actually starts to feel this lactic acid. Well, contrary to what a lot of people believe, is that lactic acid, we're going to get a lot of that, and that's going to slow you down. And no. Yes, it's going to slow you down. Why? Because lactic acid, it's building up, but it quickly disassociates to release hydrogen, and the remaining compound binds to sodium or potassium, and to form the acid salt called lactate. So lactate, there's a lot of hydrogens right in here that are getting built up, and also pyruvate. There's not a lot of oxygen. So lactate is a molecule of pyruvate that has pairs of non-oxidized hydrogens attached to it, catalyzed by lactate dehydrogenase. So essentially, what the body is doing, as the intensity increases, say you're jogging, and essentially you want to start sprinting, the intensity is going to increase, and those hydrogens are going to be released much more, and the pH in the body increases, and those hydrogens bind to pyruvate because they're here. So what does the body do? It wants to make sure that you're staying healthy and doesn't want to go into an acidic environment. So it binds all these hydrogens to the pyruvate, and that's what essentially lactate is a pyruvate with a couple of hydrogens. It serves as a temporary storage of hydrogen, and it does it in two different routes. So once it does that, it diffuses it into the interstitial space and blood for buffering and removal from the site of energy production, energy metabolism, sorry. So it moves it to the heart, the brain, to be catabolized, to catabolize lactate, and then it also provides gluconeogenic substrate for glycogen synthesis. And this is done via the Cori cycle. So once blood levels and muscle lactate increase, performance is going to, fatigue is going to set in, and definitely exercise performance diminishes. A perfect example of real life of how lactate works is right here in this picture. As you can see, this person, this runner in the blue and green, has running mechanics are on point. Lactate seems like it's not facing him yet. His stride is full. He has a full stride here. Contractions are full on. Versus this gentleman back here in black, you can tell his face. He's in pain. That he's slowing down as well. His mechanics are not as on point as the gentleman in the green and blue, and even the contractions. This knee might not be even contracting fully, mainly because lactate does not is building up, so he has to slow down. Lactate. It's bad. It's going to slow you down. Well, yes, it's going to slow you down because that's the body's mechanism to keep us in homeostasis and keep us alive and not have to worry about collapsing and dying essentially from an acidic environment. So, like I said earlier, but this chemical energy, when there's sufficient oxygen, so oxygen is critical. okay, for lactate to be cleared and to be utilized as chemical energy. So when there is sufficient O2, whether it be in the recovery process or in the or once activity diminishes or intensity, I should say, NAD plus actually scavenges for hydrogen that is attached to this lactate, and it brings it in and grabs it and sends it through an oxidation process to form ATP. Now, the carbon skeletons of the pyruvate either get utilized, become oxidized for energy, or synthesized for gluconeogenesis in the muscle itself or via the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle removes lactate release from active muscles and uses it to replenish glycogen reserves depleted from intense activity. So once this lactate is built up so much, it actually gets shifted out to the Krebs cycle through the liver, and any accumulation left over can also be sent to the brain and to the heart, because these two areas can actually synthesize and recycle that lactate. Once intense physical activity happens, carbohydrate metabolism stays high, right? So what happens? You need more energy. Let's say you're cycling. Well, your upper body is stationary, while your lower body is actually doing a lot of the work, or the majority of the work. So that glycogen from the upper body can be shifted down to the lower body to be utilized as energy. And then lactate does provide a precursor to synthesize carbohydrate via the Krebs cycle and the liver, and to support blood glucose. So it can bring it back into blood glucose levels and exercise energy requirements. So if there's more energy that needs to be created, let's say a marathon, a couple hours, a few hours, it can definitely do that whole cycle. We can look at the Krebs cycle continued here. And so glucose comes in, pyruvate gets broken down, essentially keeps going. If intensity keeps increasing, that lactate is going to build up. And as we said earlier, the body's going to bind it to hydrogen, and then it's going to get shuttled out to the liver in the Krebs cycle, and essentially it's going to bind, go in as lactate, as pyruvate, come out as pyruvate, and essentially go into either blood glucose for use as energy, or glycogen to be stored for future use. It actually also, this pyruvate can also go in and look for some fast twitch and slow twitch muscles, and try to utilize them, or to those hydrogens, and this pyruvate will turn into acetyl-CoA and enter the Krebs cycle for aerobic energy metabolism. So lactate accumulation in training, as you can see here, light and moderate activity formation and clearance are pretty much essentially equal. There's not going to be any accumulation. It can accumulate with higher intensities. However, if your aerobic training adaptations do allow for people to be able to sustain lactate, or to lactate to start at a higher intensities. So for healthy, untrained people, blood lactate begins to accumulate at about 50 to 55% of maximal capacity, versus about 75% for trained individuals. And sprint power athletes often do achieve higher blood lactate levels during short duration exercise versus untrained individuals. Here's a perfect, this is a good little chart here that I found, a graph where the estimated lactate threshold for a sprinter is definitely much shorter. And as we can see here, it can actually go higher. However, a marathoner, because their energy systems are well trained, they can actually go much further. Their lactate and estimated lactate threshold is going to be higher. So what is the lactate threshold? That's where a point where the clearance or the accumulation of lactate starts to happen. And as we can see here, it pretty much stays steady, steady rate, and then there's a point where that lactate starts to build up. And then once it builds up, there's a point where it was actually exercise intensity on the onset of blood lactate accumulation. It was interesting to see that because we don't do exercise intensity or endurance performance at VO2 max, that's not a good predictor of endurance performance. However, the onset of blood lactate accumulation is, and that is when the blood lactate concentration systematically increases to 4 millimoles per lactate. So here it is, that point, that's going to be a better predictor of endurance performance. There is the presentation on lactate. So essentially lactate can be built up. It actually clears, but if intensity does increase, then the core cycle comes in. The brain utilizes, the heart utilizes that lactate for clearance and for essentially for more energy down the road, whether it be for more glucose or for glycogen for future use. If you have any questions, please shoot me a comment, and thank you very much. Here's my references that I used for this presentation. Thank you. Have a good day.